Hello, everyone, and welcome to the monthly NASW Pennsylvania Chapter webinar. My name is Rachel Rose, and I am the Membership and Communication Strategist. This is a free webinar series and is done as a member benefit and is available to members only. Webinars are done each month on the last Wednesday of the month at 12 p.m. and count for 1 CE credit. During the webinar, if you have any questions, type them into the questions section of the menu on the side. To obtain your CE credit, you must attend a maximum of 50 minutes of this webinar. After the webinar, if you attended the minimum 50 minutes, you will receive an email with a link to complete the evaluation. The link will also be posted in the chat section near the close of the webinar. The certificates will be sent to you via email in a few days. Please note that certificates are not automatically generated, but will be sent by one of our staff members. So please allow a couple of days before you contact us to say that you haven't received your certificate. Now I would like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Tammy Mitski, MSSA, LSW, CT, Assistant Professor of Social Work and Applied Sociology at Mercyhurst University in Erie, PA. She is a licensed social worker and certified thanatologist who has been working with children, teens, and families for over 20 years. Tammy has worked with the Erie County Office of Children and Youth, Highmark Caring Place, Community Counseling Center of Mercer County, Francis Medical Care, and Thiel College. Tammy received her BSW from Edinburgh University of Pennsylvania and her MSSA from Case Western Reserve University, and her DSW from Millersville and Kutztown University. Her research interests include grief and loss, self-care wellness curriculum, and social work education, and utilizing the community of inquiry framework to examine and design distance education formats in social work curriculum. Tammy is a member of the National Association of Social Workers, the Council of Social Work Education, the Association of Bachelorette Social Work Program Directors, and the Association of Death Education and Counseling. Tammy is originally from Erie, PA, and currently lives in Greensville, PA. She and her husband, Greg, enjoy spending time with their 4 children, boating and traveling. Thank you all for being here today.
Well, thank you, Rachel, for that long introduction with all those difficult words to pronounce. I apologize for that, but I also want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today, because I know this is a busy time during this holiday season for all of us. So thank you for taking the time to join me today and to hear a little bit about self-care and managing loss during the holidays. So my plan for our time this afternoon is to spend some time talking about grief and loss. First of all, just kind of giving that foundation, a little bit of theory to understand how people do grieve and what people are dealing with when they experience a loss. And then we'll move more into the practical tips and kind of self-care process and tips that you can use yourself or that you can pass on to your clients, students, patients that you're working with in your practice. We will be taking questions, so please, I think, use the chat to do that, and Rachel will share those with me. So we'll take a couple pauses in the presentation to hear if you have any questions and try to answer those for you. So let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, I want to, oh, excuse me just a minute. There we go. Start with kind of a basic definition of loss. And when we're talking about loss for this presentation in particular, we'll spend a lot of time thinking about loss due to death, because that's typically what we think about when we talk about grieving. But I like to think about this in more of a broad perspective, a broad spectrum of losses. And for today, for our presentation, we're going to think about loss being something that occurs when something is left behind. And sometimes this is by choice and sometimes by circumstance. So when we think about circumstances, something like a loss due to death or a natural disaster or things like that, by choice, it may be choosing to leave a job, choosing to go off to college, choosing to move to a new city or a new home. So those even things that are happening in our lives that maybe things that we choose and maybe positive things in many ways still come with kind of a grief process and still can be considered a loss. So some of the types of loss that I want to think about today are, of course, death. We also talk about pet loss and how significant that is to many of us. Pets have become very important in our lives, and we do consider that a loss when they can no longer be with us. You can see some of the other areas of loss that we deal with in our lives, from divorce and deportation to maybe loss of employment, and that may be circumstance or it may be by our own choice as well. We also can think more on maybe even a macro level and talking about organizations and what we deal with within organizations and the change that is happening there, losses that occur, maybe much of the workforce being laid off or fired. Also community type issues related to loss, including disaster, which can be man-made, and often natural disasters as well. So as we're talking today, I do want to talk about and think about loss in that broad spectrum. But of course, much of the theory that I will present to you and share with you, and even when we talk about some of the tips and kind of self-care mechanisms that we can use, are going to be related to loss due to death as well. So when we talk about loss, we think of that primary loss, but we also know that there are secondary losses involved. So you can see in this graphic that I'm sharing with you, the primary loss here is a loss of a person who died. But with that comes so many other secondary losses that we don't often identify. And you can see some of those there, some of them very tangible, like a loss of income, some more symbolic, like a loss of identity, or loss of dreams, or loss of the future, loss of maybe that sense of faith or connection to faith or spirituality, or being able to kind of depend on that, because we know many people question faith or spirituality at the time of a loss. And of course, you could put in that middle blue circle, we could put many different types of primary losses, and then consider those secondary losses that go along with it. And oftentimes it's those secondary losses that surprise people who are grieving and make grief a little more challenging, or those are sometimes the areas where we really need the support of kind of our team or the people who we have as resources to us. So grief, being the reaction to loss, is comes in many forms and different kinds of responses, from cognitive to physical, behavioral, spiritual. We often think of the emotional side or the feelings that are associated with grief, but we know that there are other responses that come along with that. We also know that grief can be immediate. We can see that reaction right away. We may see physical responses right away, and maybe the behavioral responses come later, more delayed, or sometimes even absent. We also know that grief reactions are highly individual and variable. We cannot say this is what you can expect. These are the feelings you're going to have. These are the physical responses that you're going to have, and we can guarantee that. We know that each individual grieves very differently, and this can be variable for the people that we're working with, or for ourselves as well. So looking at grief reactions, normally if I were doing this in a different format, I would ask you to share with me your grief reactions. So give yourself, just a few seconds to think about, when we're dealing with any type of loss, what are the physical reactions? What are the emotional reactions? How does our thinking and our behavior change? And does our spirituality change in any way? And what we know from research and from hearing from people who are grieving, these are some of the most common reactions that have been shared. And that's things like exhaustion. You can see nausea. A lot of people talk about their stomach hurting, maybe a tightness in the chest, weight gain or loss because of, I'm not eating like I should, or maybe I'm eating too much. Sleep issues is another one that we often see. Sensitivity to noise or sensitivity to smells even sometimes can be a reaction to grief. All of those things are kind of heightened for people who are experiencing grief. Emotional, of course, I listed some of the top ones that I've heard over and over again throughout the years that people feel when they're experiencing grief. Obviously, I couldn't list all of them. We couldn't, it would be difficult to list every feeling that we've heard from people who are grieving, but this gives us an initial sense of, what people are often dealing with. And one that you see there, relief. Sometimes people are confused by that emotion, right? That first of all, people say, well, how can you feel relieved? But if there's been maybe a difficult marriage for many, many months or years and a divorce occurs, that person may feel a little confused or sad or feel like there has been a loss, but also may feel relief at that point. So we know that there's sometimes these kind of mixture of feelings for people who are experiencing a loss. Also, behavioral and cognitive changes. So moods can change very quickly. That feeling of restlessness or maybe irritability. Again, the sleep problems. Also, we see a lot of dreams and nightmares occurring for people. We see that with children a lot. The sleep problems can also be something that we see with kids experiencing those types of issues. And then spirituality, this not being necessarily related to religion, of course it can be, but some people have a sense of spirituality that isn't aligned with a specific religion and can often be related more to that connection to the universe or searching or feeling that sense of meaning or purpose. So even if there isn't a specific relationship to a God, we may find that people question just that meaning or question how can this happen to me? I thought the world was fair, and now I no longer think that the world is fair. We can also see, kind of the opposite of that, where people feel like my faith or my spirituality or my connection with a specific religion can provide comfort or support for them during a time of grief. So the course of grief is another thing to think about, and we often hear stage theory, right? So I just finished up or am finishing up teaching a grief and loss course, and if I ever Google anything to look for a picture or maybe a video or something to share with my students, and I put anything in about grief, the first thing that comes up is stage theory, right? And I've been to conferences even recently where this is still presented as kind of that's what everyone expects, is the stage theory. And I'm sure that you've all seen those stages of grief, right? But we know that Dr. Kubler-Ross, when she did her work and published her work related to the stages of grief, her research was based on working with people who had been diagnosed with a life-threatening illness and their reaction to that. So of course, still a loss, a grieving process, and dealing with understanding how do I deal with this diagnosis and what this means for me and my family and those around me. But we've taken that stage theory and really applied it across the board. We've also taken it very literally, and Dr. Kubler-Ross would say that we don't go through those stages in an orderly fashion, that really it's not a linear process. And so I encourage you to stop talking about stages of grief, right? It puts people in a box that often just doesn't fit. When we talk to people who are grieving, and if you can think about circumstances in your life where you've experienced a loss, we know that it's not so orderly. It's just easier to talk about that way. In our society, we want to put things, we want it to be orderly. We want things to be simple and kind of a process that we can say, oh, okay, I've made it through these 2 stages. I just have 3 more to go, and then this is going to be done. But we know that it's not that simple when we talk about grief. So if it's not stages, if it's not phases or a linear process, then how would we describe grief? And when I've asked this question of my students or participants in other sessions that I've done, they've given me multiple different answers. And you can see some of those there, from a roller coaster to a tangled ball. As Rachel introduced in the beginning, I worked for the Highmark Caring Place for many years, and there they talk about a spiral of grief. And maybe waves, and feeling like the waves are slow and easy for a while, and then all of a sudden they become very difficult. Maybe at times you even feel like you're drowning. I also had a participant in a session I just did this fall who, when I asked this question, said it feels like traffic, because sometimes you're moving along just fine. And that's why I added that picture there, because I thought that was a really good way to understand this. And what he said is, sometimes you're moving along, you're driving along and things are going along just fine. And then all of a sudden you could come to a stop. You could come to a point where things are kind of clogged up and you're not going anywhere. maybe something, reminds you of that situation, or maybe there's other stressors in your life that come up that really keep you from kind of moving along and functioning okay. And I thought that also made sense when we talk about how we describe the course of grief. Some other things to think about when we talk about grief, that we don't have a timetable. We would love to be able to say, yes, you get through these stages, or grief takes about a year, but we know that we can't say that. We can't say that for ourselves. We can't say that for our clients. And that because, like I said earlier, it's so variable, so much an individual process, we really can't say that, give people a timetable of when their grief should be completed, right? Because that's not the way we think about that. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. We know that it's very complex, it's dynamic, it's always changing. There are those multiple dimensions, right? So there's the physical dimensions, there's the emotional, there's so many things involved with how we're dealing with grief that, again, it just makes it very complex. And there's no definite duration or end. And we also talk about triggers, right? So thinking back about that analogy, that the traffic, right? We could be going along just fine, and then all of a sudden something triggers some difficult feelings or triggers some memories that are difficult for us. And that's one of the things that we talk about when we think about the holidays. What some research tells us is, and it's kind of termed this, you'll hear it, a recurrence of grief, an anniversary reaction, or triggers. Those are the ones. Sometimes I think I've also heard grief bursts, and they're often brought on by certain events or different things. So some of the things that we can think about that bring back this recurrence or trigger feelings related to grief could be events. So maybe a marriage ceremony, maybe a basketball game, maybe other events at kids' schools, things that just kind of bring back memories. Maybe that person used to be there and they're no longer there. And that could be, again, due to different circumstances. It could be related to a death, or it could be divorce, or other circumstances as well. Places, so locations, right? Just driving by a place or going back to a place that you haven't been since that person was with you can be difficult. Of course, we know songs, food, smells, those are all things that bring back memories and can trigger kind of a recurrence or an anniversary reaction. And if you think about all of these things, events, photos, places, songs, food, and smells, they often relate to holidays, right? Or certain, and when we talk about holidays, we're not just talking about these winter holidays, and I'll talk about that too. But what this reminds us is that grief is not a crisis, right? There may be a crisis in the beginning, especially when you talk about maybe a natural disaster or a sudden death or a sudden deportation. Those are, of course, it's a crisis, right? But we know that this is ongoing. Grief reactions are ongoing. And it's a transition, and it really has changed that person's life. So when I talk about holidays, I want, of course, right now we're focused on our winter holidays. You see a lot of information out right now. I'm seeing things popping up almost every day related to how to cope with holidays, whether it's related to grief or just the stress, the normal stress of holidays. But I want you to think about this also in a broader sense, and think about all of the other holidays and events that we deal with throughout the entire year. We, of course, focus on these winter holidays because it is, I think, very impactful. And we definitely hear from people who are grieving that it's often the most difficult time of the year for them. But we know things like Mother's Day and Father's Day, anniversaries, birthdays, an anniversary of the death or that event can often be difficult. So we could, again, go on and on with the different things we could term as holidays or events, but I just wanted you to get a sense of thinking of this in a broader perspective. So, excuse me, when we talk about grief, we talk about this kind of clash of feelings this time of year. So we have these expected feelings during the holidays. And again, primarily these winter holidays, we think about being merry and jolly and celebrating and having all these festive occasions. Those are words that we don't typically see except at this time of year, right? So there's kind of this pressure to have this merry holiday. And even what we talk about, like, I love a good Hallmark movie, right? But there is this like sense of, okay, we need to have this Hallmark holiday. Everything needs to be perfect. We need to have our hot chocolate and our ice skating and participate in all these events and be joyful, right? But when we look at the other side of what we're dealing with feelings of loss and grief, we have all of this kind of jumble of emotions, and often very difficult emotions, right? And you can see many of them there, and we could probably add many. And what's interesting also, I think about, is if you go back to our grief reactions slide, we can see all of these different feelings, and not just feelings, but physical reactions, behavioral reactions, spiritual reactions that are happening when we're dealing with grief. When I look at these, I think about, wow, even for people who aren't grieving a loss during the holidays, we often feel some of these, right? Because there is so much pressure on us to have this jolly holiday, and to have the money to spend to buy gifts for people, to have the time to do all those little things that we all would love to be able to do, but isn't always realistic. So you add the fact that we're all kind of a little exhausted and stressed during this time of year to the typical feelings of loss that we're having, that sadness and confusion and frustration. But then our society is putting this pressure on us, right, to be jolly and merry and happy during this time. It can really bring some difficult emotions and some stressful feelings for people who are grieving. Another point to make, and you've kind of heard me say this already, is that we are not talking about recovery from grief. Grief doesn't need to be cured. It's not something we can really recover from. It's more something we are reconciled to. And this is kind of a shift in thinking, and I'll share a little bit about that when we talk about a couple of theories to help you understand grief and how people are coping with it. But mourners or grievers are healing and growing from their experiences and really become reconciled to the fact that their life has changed, and that they'll be functioning in a different way because of these changes. And it may be big, significant changes related to a death or a divorce or a move to a new city. Or it could be, I hear my students often talking about, moving to college and how different that is for them. It's different for their parents too, right? To maybe have their child away from home. So those are things that we just learn and grow from and become reconciled to versus necessarily curing or recovering from. So when we look at theories of grief and loss, we can just very briefly, without going through all of those theories, just think about in the past what we've talked about is kind of the sense of resolution, recovery, relinquishing attachment. So a lot of the work that was done early on, grief theory, was Freud and Lindman talking about attachment, and that we need to relinquish that attachment, especially when a person dies, and move on and move forward, right? And that's kind of the message we still have in many ways in our society, is that you need to move on, you need to get over this, you need to recover. It's also, that those linear stages is kind of historically what we've looked at, and also that the process is passive, that it's kind of something that happens to us and we need to make it through it. But what we're seeing in some of our newer work related to grief and loss is the idea of reconciliation. Again, becoming reconciled to those changes and to maybe kind of a new life or a new way of functioning. Also, some work with continuing bonds and meaning making and narrative reconstruction, telling our story, making meaning of our changes, continuing those bonds versus relinquishing attachment, but continuing bonds with that person, even when there's been a loss due to death. That it's also an active process, that there are tasks involved, maybe versus stages that we are passively going through, but there's this active process that we can be engaged in as grievers and can really take part in and move through as we move through the process. So the first one I want to just touch on briefly is the dual process model. And what I found is when I present this, people often, most people say, oh my gosh, that makes perfect sense. Other people are like, I still don't get it. With our brief time today, we'll just look at this briefly, and hopefully, it makes sense. But if you have questions, we'll take a minute to do that as well. So we have in the dual process model, what this theory says is that people who are grieving have to kind of oscillate between this loss-oriented approach and this restoration-oriented approach, and that is a healthy way of grieving, a healthy way of coping with a loss. So the loss-oriented, you can see is really focused on doing that grief work. So we talk about allowing people to feel the feelings, right? To not avoid them, to really stay focused on the grief work, relinquishing or continuing or relocating bonds, kind of changing that, right? Because oftentimes the relationship has changed, even with a divorce situation. You may be able to continue some connection there, but of course it has changed. For children, that can change depending on where they're living and how their relationships with each parent has changed. Definitely when we talk about a loss due to death, the relationship has changed when that person is no longer physically here. So doing the work on that and really looking at focusing on those feelings. But we want people we also have to go to the other side on the restoration oriented and think about how are we attending to life changes. We're going to have to do some new things, right? We're going to have to focus on how things have changed, maybe changing the roles and how we function, looking at how our identity has changed, maybe some new relationships at some point. But what this theory says is that we don't really want our clients or ourselves to focus on just loss or restoration, right? We don't want that avoidance of grief. We also don't want that avoidance of restoration, and that it's healthy for people to kind of go back and forth between the two. And I'm going to, when I talk about some of the kind of coping mechanisms and tips and practical things people can do, they relate directly to either having that loss focus or having more of a restoration focus. The other one that I talked about a little bit was the continuing bonds. And this is important. We're seeing more and more work on this and also creating meaning. And so it shifts again from that historical emphasis on detachment and really says, no, Freud, it's not pathological to have a continuing relationship when the loss is due to death, but it's okay to still maintain that connection. Obviously, it's a different connection, right? And we're not expecting people to have the same relationship. The physical absence is no longer there, but maintaining some sort of connection through memories, through photos, through things like letter writing, journal writing, can actually be very healthy. Where we've seen as that in the past is more of kind of a pathological or something that we would worry about. So for this framework, we would be looking at how can we maintain or enhance that relationship and seeing that as a healthy response. So some of the things that I'm going to talk about with the tips and kind of healthy coping relate to this as well. I also, of course, because we're social workers, we want to talk about a strengths-based framework. And we obviously grief, when we talk about grief, it's those difficult feelings. It's all those things that we talked about earlier as far as those reactions to grief. But we know that people have inherent strengths, that we have coping abilities, and we have resources. And that grief is actually a normal and natural process. And we don't want to pathologize it. We want people to know this is normal, right? These are the reactions that we expect to see. And that's really the start. And then we can start looking at what are the strengths that that person has. And some of those individual strengths can just be, competencies. What are things that they're good at? What have you used in the past that are coping skills that have been helpful for you? Looking at their hopes, their dreams, what they still have as far as hopes for the future. And sometimes that can take some time to get there, but it is something that we can kind of draw from. We can also, of course, draw from the environmental resources that people have, their relationships, their team, their connections that they have. Could be informal like that, their family and their friends, but could also be more formal resources like, so their social worker, their counselor, maybe a support group that they're attending. Those are all environmental resources that we can draw on when we're helping our clients. So this can be a valuable tool for us, right, to be focusing on their strengths versus their deficits or those difficult things that they're dealing with. Of course, it doesn't mean that we want to avoid that. We still need to have, again, that loss orientation at times and help people to really sit with their feelings so that they're able to kind of process that. So before we move to this practical tips and coping skills section, I just want to be sure that we're on the same page. Does anybody have any questions? Rachel, did we get any questions about what I've covered so far?
I have one question here. Are there any differences by gender in how you have seen grief and loss experienced and expressed?
Yes, definitely. Great question. So we could do a little whole seminar on that, right? But what we typically talk about are instrumental and intuitive grievers, and it really does kind of align with gender. However, it doesn't have to. So intuitive grievers are more the female orientation, where we're looking at people who like to talk about their emotions, who can kind of sit with it, and they want to process through verbal communication. So you think about like that support group approach or an individual counseling approach, where most women, but not always, again, and will want to sit and talk about what they're feeling and have and find some relief in expressing those feelings verbally, oftentimes, right? But just know that this is also a spectrum, that you could be maybe more intuitive, but you might be more instrumental, or you might kind of fall in the middle. Instrumental is typically associated with a male side, and more of like kind of an active approach, that they want to do things. So maybe go out and I'm going to run this 5K to remember this person, or I'm going to, make changes in my house, or I'm going to go, it's really more of an active approach versus sitting and talking. So that also does kind of lend to what kind of coping skills they're going to use, what kind of interventions that we might use, depending on where they fall within that kind of instrumental to intuitive grieving styles. Thank you. Anything else, Rachel?
No, that's all I have right now.
Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about some of these practical tips and kind of coping skills. So what I want to start with is something that I've used. I've used it with kids a lot, this kind of circle of control, and thinking about what's within our control and with what's outside of our control. And I actually found this one. I did not do this one myself, but I found it online, and I thought it applied to our kind of holiday approach with the ELF control. Is kind of a fun activity to do with kids, but get them thinking about what is really within our control. And that's where we want to focus our efforts, right? Because we can't control what other people are saying to us, what our family is doing, what our friends are saying, the weather, and of course, oftentimes we cannot control that loss. So when we start thinking about what we can control, that's really a good, I guess, starting point to think about what are some of those tips that we can, practical tips that we can use. So, excuse me. So first of all, avoiding unhealthy coping mechanisms. So it's easy to jump right to what should we do, but I want to at least take a moment to just mention some of the things we shouldn't do, right? Or we shouldn't. And obviously, substance abuse, gambling, those types of things we don't want to do personally, or encourage our clients or patients or students to be doing. But we also, excuse me, often hear people say, "I just want to get away," right? I want to skip Christmas. I want to skip the holidays. I'm maybe going to just go on vacation. And what we then often hear from people is that I tried that and it didn't work so well, because it's very difficult to completely escape a holiday. There may be times where just doing things differently is a healthy way to cope, maybe kind of changing some of the traditions, which we'll talk about, but trying to find that complete escape is oftentimes very difficult to do, because our holidays kind of follow us no matter where we are. So we would not necessarily recommend that. Again, that if you think about that loss orientation or restoration orientation, that would be very much like that denial and avoidance of the issue kind of approach, which some people may need, but we want to be careful about people staying in that side and really never getting over and focusing on their loss or focusing on those feelings that go along with the loss. So some other practical tips that we want, that we can use, would be to organize and plan in advance. So I'm hoping that I can bring this up and show you this link. So this is a checklist from the American Hospice Foundation, and there's many checklists out there. I like this one. I think this has been useful. So you can see this Coping with Holidays checklist. And what they recommend is to have your family members maybe each do one of these. So for our clients, we could say, take this home, you do this, have your children do it, have your spouse do it, and think about, because of this loss or this change we've had in our family, is there anything we want to do differently? Because we know that each person in that family may have some different ideas. So that's one way to kind of involve the entire family in the process. Of course, this can be done individually as well. But it's really thinking about those typical winter holiday traditions as far as cards and decorations. And I'm going to scroll down here a little, looking at shopping and music and, where do we go and do we make the same foods? Where do we have dinner? And it really helps people to kind of think through the process. And again, very practical way of thinking about what do we want to do this time around? Do we need to change anything? Do we need to add anything? Sometimes people, need to add some maybe new traditions. So again, here starting new traditions, maybe a memorial or a charitable activity, or do they want to just keep things exactly the same as they had in the past? And we do, one thing to think about is for children, right? Oftentimes children, we as adults want to kind of change things and maybe do things differently or skip the holidays altogether, but children often want things to stay very much the same and want kind of that continuity, right, during their holiday season. So that's something to think about, and another way that you could maybe use that kind of checklist to talk to a child about how, how is this going to work for you? What do you want to see for this holiday? Another thing would be that expectation management. So we know one of the things that we cannot control is how our family and friends react to what we're doing or not doing during a holiday. But if we share with them and communicate with them, sometimes that kind of manages the expectations by saying something like, well, I know we've always come to your house and spent the entire day on Christmas Day. This year, I'm just not going to be able to do that. I'll stop by for half an hour, but then that's what I feel like I can manage, so that they know ahead of time what you're planning to do or to not do. That can definitely help some reactions, not completely, because again, it's something we can't control, but it can maybe help kind of counteract some of that. Another thing to think about is considering who will fill the vacated roles. This can be, and this goes to that restoration approach, right? So there's some things that have to change, things that have to be different because of someone who's no longer there. And again, this could be something like a divorce situation or imprisonment or deportation, where that person is just not there to maybe function in the role that they had in the past. It could be as simple as who is sending the holiday cards, who's carving the turkey, who's going to go to that basketball game that that child is expecting that person to be there for. Can we fill that in another way? And kind of trying to anticipate some of that before that actually comes up in the moment can be very, very helpful for people. Another thing that people can do is preparing food that the person likes or liked, of course, depending on the type of loss. And that's related again to, the loss, kind of sharing memories, continuing some bonds if that's possible. But it can kind of connect us to that person, whether they're there or not. Sharing memories, of course, saying that person's name, maybe lighting a candle, creating a memory box. So, and we think of like creating a memory box or some of the kind of activities that we often see, making ornaments, things like that, is something for children, but it can also be very helpful for adults as well to create something, right? To have something to remember that person. And if they're filling that box with photos or other memorial items that they have, they're going to end up talking about that and sharing that, right? And probably dealing with some of those difficult feelings related to the loss. But it also keeps them connected in a healthy way and continuing those bonds as well. The other thing that we often see people do that's been helpful is to plan something special or fun for after the holiday. So maybe they're going to get through the holiday, think about, I'm not going to totally skip this season, but if I can look forward to something afterwards, maybe something I've never done before, maybe it's a spa day with friends, maybe it's actually taking a trip, to kind of think, okay, if I can get through this, if I can do this within, what's healthy for me, then I have this to look forward to after the holidays, to kind of restore, right? To really do something maybe a little different, or kind of fill our cup a little bit after we might feel a little bit drained. So more practical tips. And I included this, you control your jingle, because I heard it at a conference in the past, and I wish I could remember who. I searched and searched to see if I could find this, and I can't, or I would happily give credit to the folks that shared this at a seminar that I had attended, but they had said, you control your jingle, and that really stuck with me, because it is something that we can say, oh, it's okay for me to say no, that I can be sensitive to my own needs and my own emotions and what I'm dealing with at that time, at this, these difficult holiday times, no matter what time of year that is. And so you can accept invitations or decline them, or say, I can only come for a half an hour. I can't make it for the entire time. And that's okay, right? We want people to feel some level of control within what they're doing. We also want to encourage people to use those resources, use those strengths, right? So hopefully the people that we're working with or within our own lives, we have people who are part of our team, right? Who we know we can depend on. And maybe we have somebody we know we can call and talk to, and they'll just listen. Maybe we encourage our clients, well, make sure you're still coming to counseling, right? Even though it's a busy time of year, we still want you to come in. Maybe it's somebody who can shovel the sidewalk, right, when the snow comes. Those kinds of resources and the people that we have on our team can be valuable to us personally, and again, to our clients, our students, our patients. So also consider doing for you versus doing for others. So this, again, is another part of this time of year, is that we are, it's a great thing, right? That we're charitable and that we're doing things for other people this time of year. And it always makes me feel good about our world when I see these things happening. But we know sometimes you have to take a step back and do that self-care, do things for ourselves, and encourage our clients to do the same. I talked about this a little bit, considering the needs of the family, because children may have different needs than the adults. So this is one tool that I often use. Over the years, I've used this because I think it's very simple. You can Google this and find this document online, but it's called Full or Empty. And it is really what you have your client do is, on the arrows that are going in, you have them write things that give them energy. So activities or experiences, or maybe even people that they can talk to that really give them energy, that nurture them. And then the arrows going out are more focused on those things that kind of deplete us or drain us, things that obviously don't give us any energy in that moment. And then I think it's an excellent visual to think about. Look at all those arrows going out, and maybe I need to find some more arrows going in, and really trying to balance that, because we all have both. We should all have both, hopefully, but maybe we have somebody who doesn't have much going in, right? And that can provide them with a visual to say, this is where we need to make some changes, or where we need to find some things that you're doing regularly that are going to help energize you and nurture you, and help get you through this difficult time. So I also, this is a self-care assessment, and I'm going to go ahead and click on this, and hopefully this pops up. So here we go. So this is a self-care assessment that I have used. And again, you can use that link or find other self-care assessments online. Excuse me. And what it really does is go through and look at the different areas of self-care. And what I typically have done when I've used this with clients or students, and you can see they have this kind of rating here from 3 to 0. I haven't used this a whole lot. I've used it a couple times, but what I typically have people do is just think about, are you doing this now? Is this something you do? And then we can talk about how we can continue that. Is this something that you thought, oh, this is something I'd really like to do. I never thought of that as something that I can do for self-care. And then we talk about how we can incorporate that into a self-care plan. I also have people think about, what are some of the things you just can't do? So sometimes I use this with students, whether I've done counseling with them or with the students I'm working with in class now. They can't do things like get massages or go on vacation oftentimes, right? There's financial issues related. So I say, it's okay, let's just cross that out. That's just not something that we can do. We would, love to do that, but that's not something you can do right now. And then it helps relationship, workplace, so overall balance. So they have a nice array of different areas that people can use to practice self-care. So that's one resource that you can use as well. And then a self-care plan. So you can see here on the right, a plan that I created that I use with my students and have used in a couple other workshops that I've done. And it's focused on creating self-care goals within different areas. And because I'm trying to get my students to think about creating goals that are measurable, I use this as another way for them to think about how can I make my self-care goals measurable. So you can see the SMART goals kind of on the side there. And I have them look at different areas of their self-care. So this is a 2-page form, but I'm just sharing a little bit there with you. And it's easy to create, a template to get people to think about physical self-care, emotional, psychological, cognitive, all of those areas that assessment addressed, you can also address in a plan. And this is one from the University of Buffalo. And I'll show you, they're just a little bit different. A little more open as far as how what their current practice is, the new practice, and then also goes into how they will maintain that, which I think is also helpful. Sometimes I've worked with students and patients on what's your emergency self-care plan, what are you going to do in that moment, right, when something happens that you need to deal with. So kind of more crisis-oriented kind of self-care plans. But there's a lot of different resources out there. But I encourage people that I've worked with to really look at what's worked for them, right? So those exception questions like, okay, so right now isn't so great, but in the past, what were you doing, when things were going okay? What worked in the past, and what resources do you have, whether those are informal or formal resources, and incorporating those strengths and resources into their self-care plan. Because as we know, that's only going to help them to be successful if we use what they already have. And of course, making those goals measurable so that they can see progress. So these are some self-care ideas. I think, oftentimes, especially with my students who are undergraduates, they often think about self-care and they think about getting their nails done and massages and things like that, which is great and can, nurture us and make us, maybe feel like we're healing and taking some time for ourselves. But there are many, many other ways that we can incorporate self-care. And of course, just like grief is very individual, self-care is very individual, because some people would love, as I put the photo of the people out walking in the snow. Some people would love that. Some people would not love that, right? And want to be out in the cold in the middle of winter. But for others, it can be something that's healing and nurturing. So we have to look at things individually and look at different ideas, maybe things that we haven't thought of, things that our clients haven't thought of. So providing some ideas about self-care and doing things that are meaningful and nurturing can be helpful as well. And one thing that I wanted I've used this quote before, and it's meaningful to me because I think it really speaks to how we're thinking about grief and how we should think about grief, and the messages that we should share with people who are dealing with loss is that we don't have a rule book or a time frame, and that grief is individual, and therefore the way we cope with our loss and get through our grief process is very different and very individual, and that people need to do what is right for their soul and what works for them. So that's something that's meaningful to me that I hope you find meaning in as well. And a couple links to resources that I wanted to share with you. So I wrote this little article for the New Social Worker, and so I included a link to that. I noticed that she shared it on Facebook today, which I thought was nice because there's some nice little tips in there that just grieving during the holidays. And then a couple resources there. So if you're not familiar with TAPS, excellent resource, mainly focused on military, but have so many resources, offer free webinars and things that can be helpful. And also some self-care resources as well. University at Buffalo School of Social Work has excellent resources for self-care, and some there related to the Center for Loss as well. And then I also provided, provided the my bibliography. So there's a lot of great resources here that you can, get some of these books, and some of them are nice, short little, like the Miller book, How Will I Get Through the Holidays? There's some other ones that are just short and easy for people to look at. The Wolfelt book, the 100 Practical Ideas, is a great resource as well. So I wanted to make sure that you had some of those resources. So I will be happy, Rachel, if there's been any questions, to try to answer some of those.
Okay, the first question is, does aging apply in terms of grieving? For instance, body parts needing replacement, not being able to do what we could a few years before.
Yes, definitely. And that's a great example of that broad spectrum when we think about grief and loss. We definitely think about life transitions and life changes being really a loss. So when I've done this workshop in the past, I've had people do the life stress inventory. If you've ever seen that, I recommend it, because it looks at all the different life stressors, going from loss due to death to, but things like marriage or taking a vacation, or all those things that we think of as positive, right, but are often very stressful, and often can be considered a loss in different ways. And that helps to think about that broad perspective. And we definitely think about aging, our physical changes, whether that's in appearance, because for many people that is something that they're tied to, is their appearance and their physical beauty, and how that fades over time can be very difficult. Think about our physical changes, maybe chronic illness. So it's not just a diagnosis of a life-threatening illness, it could be a chronic illness that we're can often be dealing with from a very young age, but definitely we see more in our aging population. And we know that that can cause those same kind of grief reactions. Also related to grieving, you can think about aging, is thinking about retirement and role changes, and the loss of friends and family who are aging alongside you. So our aging population is dealing with those, what we call a buildup of losses, a pileup of losses, oftentimes, which can then add to the difficulty of the grief process as those kind of losses continue. So great question. Yeah.
The next question is, how can we help children of different ages experience grief and loss?
Oh, that I would love to be able to cover that, but I did a whole session just on helping children grieve. I would direct you to the resources of the NAGC, National Alliance for Grieving Children. Highmark Caring Place has some great resources for related to working with children. Wolfelt, so you can see on the bibliography there towards the bottom a couple of his resources. It has some great work. That Healing the Bereaved Child is an excellent resource for working with kids. When I actually did a similar presentation at the NASW-PA conference, I actually provided some actual activities that can be done during the holidays. So feel free to reach out to me if you want me to share that PowerPoint with you, that information with you. I'd be more than happy to do that, because we would have to spend quite a bit of time talking about developmental needs, and then of course the interventions that go along with those developmental needs for children. But I would be, if you email me, I'd be happy to share those resources with you.
The next question is, you addressed gender differences in grief. Please comment on cultural differences that we need to be aware of and sensitive to.
Right. And that's a great point as well. And again, a whole other session, and something that, I don't have the time to address in this session. But I think an excellent point to think about how people grieve differently depending on their culture and depending on the needs of their specific family, and how that can definitely affect their reactions. We also know that in some cultures, people the whole process, especially with a loss due to death, the whole process of grieving is kind of defined in a different way. Even their rituals and their traditions, funerals, things like that can be very different. And it's something that we should be aware of. That first book on my bibliography, The Last Dance, Encountering Death and Dying, has a significant focus on culture related to death and dying, and I would recommend that as a resource for looking at how people grieve, specifically following the loss due to death. And again, if you email me, I'd be happy to share some more resources that I have on culture. But I think at the very least, your question makes the point that we do need to definitely be aware of how our culture and our societal differences impact how we grieve and how our clients are dealing with grief. Thank you. Anything else?
What is a good approach with seniors who are regularly experience losses with friends, spouses, and health?
Right, so I think just providing that support and going, if you're talking about specifically related to holidays, then you'd want to go back to those same kind of practical tips. But if you're talking more in general related to grief and loss, we typically what research has shown us is that we need to connect our aging population with other people who are having similar experiences. We know this to be true in grief in general when we're talking about kids who are grieving, adults who are grieving. Having the support of people who are at least dealing with similar circumstances helps them to feel like they're not alone and to feel like they have validated, right, in what they're feeling and what they're going through. So the same can be said for our aging population, connecting them through support groups and through just being able to process with people who are having those similar experiences. So like I said earlier, maybe dealing with role changes related to retirement. Who am I now if I'm no longer a physician? Who am I now if I'm no longer a teacher, right? How have my roles changed? I don't have the friendships that I used to. I don't have that support system. So connecting them again with people with similar experiences and maybe people that they can connect with and form relationships and kind of form those resources that they need. So that is one thing that we can definitely do. We see people who are living in aging communities. Research has shown that they're dealing, I guess, coping, I don't want to say better, maybe with more resources and more connections because they are right there around them. So we see research has shown that people who are kind of on their own, maybe feeling very isolated, can struggle the most, right, with their grief and loss experiences and maybe not being able to cope in such a healthy way. So my recommendation for everyone is always to have that support and to go back to those resources and those strengths. But sometimes we have to make those more formal for people who are kind of a little more isolated or don't have those connections informally.
We could do one more question if you're up for it.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about grief work for couples experiencing infertility around the holidays?
Oh, I don't have, I'd have to think back about the research that I've read, and I haven't seen a whole lot specific to holidays related to infertility. That's a great question. But again, if you reach out to me, I can see what I can find out. I'm gonna write myself a note here about dealing with grief at the holidays related to infertility, because that is a very specific kind of loss and grief experience, especially at the holidays when you're around family who are probably, asking those things that, again, going back to what we can't control and when are you having a baby, or people are showing up with their babies. And I'm sure that presents itself in a very difficult way for couples who are dealing with that. So I would have to honestly do some more research to see what I could find, but I would be happy to discuss that if you want to reach out and see what we can find together. I would be interested in doing that. It's a great question. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much, Tammy, for that wonderful presentation, and thank you to our members for attending. The link to the evaluation has been posted in the chat section and will remain up for a few minutes. A reminder that after you submit your evaluation, if you attended the required 50 minutes, you will receive your CE certificate via email within a few days. Thank you, everyone.